Plant spotlight number 5 today. We're focusing on Philodendron atabapoense, or at least that's how I pronounce it. I'm not too sure if that's the right way to say it, but it sounds fun, so I'll stick with it. All right, Philodendron atabapoense is a little bit different to the ones I showed you before, and it is my first non-velvet. Clearly, I'm starting with all my favorites with this plant series, and I think it's quite obvious why. I think it just adds a little bit of texture and different shape to my plant collection. It's no secret, I love a good velvet, heart-shaped leaf philodendron, but I really like this like long boy as well. And I think it's highly underrated. Philodendron Spiritus Sancti is kind of considered the holy grail. I think this atabapoense, when it matures, is looking very similar. Obviously not the same, but it's looking very similar at a fraction of the price. So it is super underrated, and if you can get your hands on one of these, I highly recommend it. So today I want to first show you the journey the atabapoense and I have been through over the last 2.5 years. And then I'll go into detail about everything that I've learned about this plant over that time. So let's get started. I've got it as a cutting in December 2019, and it was honestly one of my first plants. I got it because it is a non-velvet, and usually the non-velvets are a little bit easier to take care of. So I really wanted to try my luck with a non-velvet climbing plant first and trial out some of my moss pole techniques. So when it was posted to me in December 2019, I was so excited to start trying out moss pole techniques that I didn't wait and I just popped it on a moss pole straight away, which was definitely a mistake. After a plant was posted to you, it's already gone through a bit of shock. My mix wasn't right back then. The moss pole wasn't right back then. I didn't have the right conditions back then either. I gave it way too little light and so on. So it was kind of doomed from the beginning. I didn't really know what I was doing. So, I popped it on that moss pole and it just did absolutely nothing for a very long time. And then it slowly started pushing out these teeny tiny leaves and didn't even attach itself to the moss pole. So I was definitely a bit premature potting it up. Now in hindsight, I know that I should have just, maybe put it in water for at least 24 hours after it was posted to me, then assess the root system. And if the root system isn't large enough, I should have just propagated for another couple of weeks before I start popping it on a moss pole. My mix that I used with the moss pole was way too dense and kept way too much water, or retained way too much water, didn't have enough aeration. And back then I was, I always started with my plant journey for aesthetic reasons. So I put the plants where I wanted the plant to be for aesthetic reasons, not really considering if the plant might like that spot either. So I didn't give it enough light back then for sure. So, it is what it is. At least it didn't die. But yeah, after just doing absolutely nothing for like 3 months, and I didn't have see-through pots, so I couldn't really see what was going on with the root system either. So after a couple of months, I was a bit impatient and I just removed it from the moss pole. I dug it out of the pot and I just checked on it, and it definitely had a bit of root rot. But that's okay. It wasn't too bad. Potted it in a new pot in April 2020, and I didn't put a moss pole with it because at this stage I wasn't really planning on popping it on a moss pole again, a little bit discouraged by my first experience. But, that's how life is, trial and error. In the meantime, I experimented a little bit more with moss poles, with my Monstera adansonii, with my Sitapecana, and I learned some lessons with those plants that I was then able to, implement in that plant's journey. So yeah, you can see on that screen in April 2020, there's definitely a few more leaves popping up. It's growing. It's still really small, but it was growing. So in June 2020, I then decided to just take a top cutting and start fresh. So I rooted that top cutting in water, and once it had sufficient roots, so it had these secondary roots, meaning that there's roots coming off of your existing roots, I then started putting it, I then potted it up, and I was just waiting for it to grow a couple more leaves. At that stage, it wasn't really climbing just yet. You can actually still see some of these small leaves down here. They've obviously suffered throughout the years a little bit, but at the very beginning, it was actually growing with very small internodal spacing. So being nice and bushy, like very similar to a Biliatii or Bilitae, or however you want to pronounce that one. So very similar to that. So I didn't see a need to give it a moss pole straight away. So I just gave it that small 10 centimeter pot for it to establish and grow a nice root system. And then once it had to be repotted, I then put it in a 14 centimeter pot, and then I added it onto a moss pole. So it started on that moss pole in November 2020, and by January 2021, it attached to the moss pole and it started throwing out new leaves, and the leaves were continuously getting better. So I know that at that stage, I'm doing a much better job when it comes to light. Yep. And then in March 2021, you can really see the leaf size is increasing. And I believe that's because the plant started attaching itself to the moss pole. And let me tell you, this plant roots like crazy. I'll turn it around, but I'll probably put some close-ups on, sorry, Brett. I'll probably put some close-ups up on screen as well. So this plant is growing a lot of roots. And what is quite unique to this plant, or unique to, probably not just unique to this plant, but compared to all my other plants, these roots also grow upwards. So when it was at a small moss pole, and the plant might have only reached about here, I actually had roots coming out the top of the pole. Even here right now, I think it's definitely out of screen, but even right now, I've got roots sticking out the top. Now, another thing that I really love about this plant is the backs. So it has these really beautiful red, I hope the camera picks this up. Definitely the new growth up here. You can see that the new growth is really red at the beginning. Over time, the leaves will definitely fade more to like a purple magenta. But when they first come out, they're actually quite red. But they keep it. So they don't fade all the way. They just get a little bit darker over time, not so super bright red. And by now you probably know I'm a sucker for anything red at the back. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. So you can tell by the photo on screen in July 21, it started having a lot of leaves, but it wasn't really climbing the moss pole that much, right? But it definitely attached its roots to the moss pole. So, I mean, that's really how the plant would grow in nature. In nature, it would attach itself to a tree. Once it finds the tree, it would just take its roots and really wrap the roots around the tree trunk to secure itself. Just with the additional benefit that over here, with the moss pole, it doesn't just secure itself to the moss pole. These roots are also turning into water roots, being able to absorb water and nutrients, giving it as much energy or as much potential as possible to mature. Once it did kind of get the hint that, hey, there is a moss pole though, it really started climbing much quicker with larger internodal spacing. And again, that's exactly what this plant would do in nature. So in December 21, it reached the top of its first pole. So that's quite slow, right? So at that stage, I got the plant 2 years ago, but pretty much the first year, I just kind of fluffed around with it and kind of messed it up. So the first year, I wasn't really super successful, but that's totally fine. That's part of the plant journey. Keep that in consideration whenever I show you these plant spotlights. You know, for example, my Splendid only took 1.5 years to climb up 3 poles, and I had to chop and extend it twice. But that's considering that I already knew exactly what I was doing by the time I got this Splendid. I didn't need to experiment with it because I already experimented with my methods and I was happy with the approach that I found and I just applied it, right? Whereas this plant I got at the very beginning, so it took a little while longer because I wasn't really sure what exactly I'm supposed to do with it yet. But once I kind of knew, then it started climbing quite quickly. So I extended it in December. And now, half a year later, it almost is at the top of its extension. So, you know, once it's established, and that's probably with most plants, once it's established, it's growing so much faster. That beginning, that initial stage, propagating it, putting it on a moss pole, making sure the plant starts attaching itself to the moss pole, that's the part that takes quite a long time. But then once the plant has a good root system available, you found a spot that it likes, then it's really going to start growing up pretty quickly. So don't shortcut that initial stage, you know, don't pop it on a moss pole, you know, trying to rush it. Give it its time when it's still a small plant and you will be rewarded for it in the long run. That's all I've got to say about this plant's journey. It still hasn't gone through a full chop and extend, so it's definitely a plant that, you know, you can get and you don't have to worry about repotting it or, you know, extending it all too often. So actually something I forgot to say, when I extended it from 90 to 180 centimeters, that's also when I potted it up or repotted it from a 14 centimeter pot into a 20 centimeter pot. Because it was fairly root bound at that stage, but also just because the 20 centimeter pot gives me a larger surface area, so it's less likely to fall. Oh, jeez, I just thought I had a mealybug, but it was moss. Would have been my first mealybug ever. Often get asked, how do you make sure your poles don't fall? So if I just put it here, the pole is kind of a bit wonky, which is to be expected given that all of the leaves are on one side, so making it really heavy towards the front. But I have these decorative planters, and I don't have a specific type of decorative planter. I just buy all sorts. The 20 centimeter pot pretty much fits all of them. It's another reason why I'm being pretty consistent with my pot sizes, just 10, 14, and 20 centimeters. First and foremost, because those are the only three sizes available in see-through. But also, if I use the same nursery pots, I can buy planters that fit all of them, and I can just switch them around as I like it, right? But because the planters are heavier, it really gives that plant that stability and makes sure that the plant isn't too top heavy and falls over. And additional benefit is that when you water it, any excess water is just going to be collected by the pot and you can just empty it out. In a perfect world, you would find a nursery pot that just kind of hovers on top of your see-through pot. I have a few that work like that, and then you can just water it and it drains freely down below and you don't have to worry about it. But you know, it is what it is. It's hard sometimes to find the perfect match between nursery pot and planter and then still make it look nice. And again, I grow my plants for aesthetic reasons. It obviously needs to work for the plants as well, but I want them to look nice. So yeah. This one, I don't do anything to the conditions that it's in. It's in my living area and it's quite close to a northwest facing window, so it gets quite a lot of light. I don't supplement the humidity in here. I do use a heater in winter, but really just for myself, I don't like to be cold in winter. So the temperature usually doesn't drop below 18, but apart from that, the conditions inside my living area are pretty much exactly the conditions that are outside. So the humidity, for example, can be as low as 30%, but it could be as high as 90% during a super rainy week. So I can't give you a specific humidity requirement or light requirement or temperature requirement. But I suppose the general guiding principles of don't make a drop below 16 degrees, more humidity is probably going to be beneficial for it to thrive, but maybe not necessarily for it to survive, and of course ensure airflow. So I think these guiding principles are probably the same for most of the plants, but again, you're going to keep a lot of different plants in the same room. So you do need to find a certain compromise and just pretty much give most of your plants similar conditions. Just this one seems to be liking the conditions that I've got that I can give it. So yeah, I'll continue growing it. I hope you feel inspired to pick up an Philodendron atabapoense and grow it yourself. Definitely one of my favorites and adds a little bit of texture to my collection. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.